This is GARIS masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 359, entitled Feminazi Bashing. Description. This flyer expresses the opinion that there are now enough masculists and MGTOWs out there for small groups of them to verbally harangue and attack the feminazis at gender political meetings, expressing their hatred against the massive gender injustices committed by the monoconscious feminazis against men, accusing these feminazis that if they don't become biconscious and help menfair the gender laws, then there will be a sex war in which the feminazis will be killed. Now the flyer itself. Feminazi Bashing by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer claims that there are enough masculists around now that it's time that the genocidal feminazis be actively stopped by a verbally aggressive campaign on the part of the masculists to show the hated feminazis that they have a formidable enemy, namely the masculists, particularly the masculist scientists, and even more particularly the fourth quarter masculist scientists. Since some of you reading about masculism for the first time may not be familiar with some of the above terms, I begin with some definitions. Masculists are men's libbers, that is, usually, men who rebel against being man-slaves to women, refusing to work for them, and pushing for the menfairing of the gender laws, especially in the divorce courts, which are screaming out for reform, and for the legislation of the PARER, that's P-A-R-E-R, paternity rejection right, the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, that is not against women, but against men. Women have the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't. Men are seen by the feminazis and by traditional society that these feminists influence as cash machines to be robbed and abused. Fourth quarter men are men in the fourth quarter of their lives, for example, over 65. Most such men have seen their libidos dry up, so they are no longer cunt hungry. So don't have to be nice to women in order to penis them. Such men then often argue that they no longer need to have to put up with women's considerable faults, for example, their nagging, their controlling, their emotionality, their irrationality, their hysterics, etc. Many fourth quarter men simply blot women out of their lives. Fourth quarter masculists are often the feminists, that is, third wave feminists, who aim to increase women's political power at men's expense. Most formidable enemies, especially fourth quarter masculist scientists, who are in a position to tell women what they really think, so are not motivated to be nice to women due to the cunt hunger of younger men. These older fourth quarter men can afford to be a lot more objective about women, calling a spade a spade. Feminazis are the particularly obnoxious variety of feminists who have a hatred of men, labelling men as toxic, as rapists, as male chauvinists, etc. Such feminists are often third-wave feminists who are out to seize power from men at men's expense, often abusing men, especially in the divorce courts. Masculists see feminazis as hypocrites because they are fluffy feminists. A fluffy is a masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a man by not bothering to FIP up, that is, become a FIP, that's financially independent person. by bothering to get a career-competent education, for example, by studying math and the sciences in high school so that she can earn a good living as an adult and not expect to be able to live off the labour and money of a man, that is, a gullible, ignorant, in brackets, of masculist ideas, man-slave. Fluffies are vermin to the masculists, seen as being immoral, parasitic, man-slaving vermin to be severely punished by being wiped out, having their fluffy genes removed from the gene pool, by being exterminated, by being forced to rot on the shelf, by being totally ignored, not even being pumped and dumped. Masculists see fluffies just as evil in the 21st century as the abolitionists saw slavers of Negroes in the southern states of the US in the 19th century. The slavery issue was the fundamental cause of the US Civil War. Masculists say that if women don't fib up, and if the feminazis keep blocking the men-fairing of the gender laws, then there will be a sex war in which men will snap, who will no longer tolerate being financially crucified in the hated, fluffy, feminist-dominated divorce court system, where one married father in 4 has his kids ripped from him, loses his house to his fluffy ex-wife, loses half his stuff to her, is forced to pay child support to kids he will barely see, and if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may have to pay her alimony so that she can remain a fluffy parasite for the rest of her life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up, so that she remains a parasite of him after the divorce the way she was before the divorce. Masculists have a hatred of fluffies and aim to wipe them off the face of the earth by exterminating them. Masculists are usually second-wave feminists in the sense that they approve of what the second-wave feminists were pushing for, that is, equal rights for women. For example, equal pay for equal work, equal opportunities to enter the professions, the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, fault-free divorce, being accepted as equally status-worthy by men, etc. Masculist theorists see that second-wave feminism is a prerequisite for the effective fipping of women, so that women are socialised by parents and educated by teachers and professors to be fips and not expect to parasite, fluffy style, off the labour and money of a man. Masculists have a hatred of fluffies, but have an even greater hatred of fluffy feminists, because fluffy feminists are seen by masculists as hypocrites. It's bad enough that fluffy feminists are fluffies, but since fluffy feminists claim that they are also feminists, that makes them hypocrites in the eyes of the masculists, because on the one hand, these women demand equal rights for women in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, expecting women to not have to fip up, not have to bother to accept the moral obligation to become fips as adults, pulling their own financial weight. Instead, they simply accept the traditional role of the man as a man-slave who will work for her so that she can sit on her fat parasitic ass living in a middle-class house raising her kids and having him pay for it all. That is, masculists see these fluffy feminists as halfway feminists, behaving as feminists in the parliaments but as fluffies in the divorce courts, and that makes them hypocrites and hence are spat at by the masculists. Fluffy feminists are particularly hated by the masculists for much stronger reasons. The fluffy feminists have made the divorce courts so toxic for divorcing fathers that in many Western and East Asian countries, for example South Korea and Japan, that 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. That is, they have adopted the MGTOW lifestyle, that is, men going their own way. If the gender laws are not soon men-faired, then that fraction of 2/3 will increase to over 90%, which will obviously be catastrophic in terms of wiping ourselves out by failing to reproduce ourselves. Admittedly, men's rejection of being man-slaves to women, for example, being salaryman to Jap housewife parasites with 11-hour workdays, 3-hour daily commutes, handing over his paycheck to his lazy parasitic Jap wife, who gives him a meagre allowance and then spends his money on her house and entertainment with her friends. That is the, quote, "In Japan, the husbands overwork and the wives play tennis" syndrome. Young Japanese and Korean men are so pissed off with the salaryman half-life that they simply refuse to live like that, so reject marriage and paternity. The birth rate in South Korea is now under 1 child per woman, whereas the replacement rate is 2.1. So South Korea is wiping itself out faster than any other country on earth. As alluded to above, this phenomenon may not be a bad thing for a generation or two, since it is a solution to the global warming problem. There are too many people on the planet, so if young men refuse to reproduce for a generation or two, then we can solve the global warming problem. But this state of affairs cannot continue for generations, because if it does, we do wipe ourselves out. Therefore, sooner or later, the gender laws have to be menfaired, and the feminazis have to be defeated, which is what this flyer is mainly about. How to defeat the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites, the feminazis, that is, the particularly obnoxious, in-your-face, misandrous, male-dumping, feminazi, burnable witch type feminists, who are so hated not only by masculists but by men in general, because no man wants a relationship with a feminazi shrew. Such women deserve to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by men, who punish them by ignoring them totally, not even pumping and dumping them, so that such women fade away into the dustbin of history. This flyer makes suggestions on how small masculist groups at universities or at gender political meetings, for example by third-wave feminists who aim to increase women's political power by abusing men, or at masculist meetings that are invaded by feminist groups, can verbally attack the feminazis with a masculist harangue, making it very clear to the monoconscious feminazis, that is, feminists who know nothing about masculist ideas, who have only had one gender political consciousness raised, who therefore tend to be rather feminazi bitchy, feminazi biased, who think that gender oppression is a one-way street, who are unfamiliar with how women oppress men, and far worse than vice versa, for example, with women's financial parasitism, women's manslavery, women's gender crimes against men, for example, paternity fraud, women's lying about not taking the pill, getting pregnant and then slamming a paternity suit on the father, etc. Masculists are fed up with the misandry of the feminazis, so are strongly motivated to teach these feminazi bitches masculist ideas, to shut them up, so that these monoconscious feminazi bigots are forced to recognise that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, and that if the gender laws are not soon men-faired, then these monoconscious feminazi bigots will be treated as genocidal criminals who are indirectly wiping out whole populations and hence have to be stopped with bullets if necessary. This is the end of part 1.